Okay, so I'm John from Town of Rochester Environmental Conservation Commission, or ECC for short. Just a little bit about the ECC. We're a group of volunteers who are dedicated to the environment, and we want to make a difference on a local level. We joined the Town of Rochester. We're not a board, but we're an advisory committee, but we're still part of the local government. Every third Thursday of each month, we present a monthly series of speakers relating to nature and our local environment. And it's called Third Thursday Nature Series. We were doing this in person, but we got stopped by the coronavirus for a while and started going online because, you know, it could be the new normal, and we want to keep on doing it. So anyway, some of the topics that we're going to cover or have covered are native plants, local geology, permaculture, birds. We had a great bird presentation, mushrooms, astronomy, fishing, foraging, and bees and pollinators. That brings us to tonight's presentation by Peter Nelson, filmmaker and 30-year beekeeper. Oh yeah, and also photographed this documentary called The Pollinators, which I saw and loved. And we're going to get to see a little piece of that tonight. So let's switch over to Peter and have him do it.
Great. Well, thank you. I really appreciate being here. It's really nice to see you all. And I have to warn you, it's always dangerous to ask a beekeeper to talk about bees because it's hard to shut us up.
Excuse me, can I ask a question here? Because my wife Ann works for the Bluestone Press. Can we record this? Is that okay with you? Everybody?
Yeah, I think so. Madeline, are you recording this anyway for playback later on?
I am. Yeah, I could. It's up to you.
Oh, yeah.
If you want me to share the file with you, I can do that.
Well, either way, I'm just want to make sure it's okay.
That'd be great.
Yes, please do.
You're going to be in the press.
Okay.
All right. So as John kindly said, I'm a filmmaker. I live here in Accord, and I also am a beekeeper. Been a beekeeper, backyard beekeeper here for a little over 30 years. I never have more than 5 hives. Right now I have 4. And so it's strictly a hobby for me. My film that I directed and photographed and co-produced is called The Pollinators. And what I did with that was that I followed commercial migratory beekeepers around the United States over a season of pollination to look at managed honeybees and our food system, their importance to our food system, as a way to talk about bees, but then also talk about our somewhat messed up agricultural system, and also some ideas about how to make it better. And we just, I'll give myself a little plug here. We just came out on the digital streaming platforms, so we're available. The film is available on iTunes, Amazon, Google Play, and a bunch of other sort of those platforms. And subscription will be coming up probably this fall. And I'm also a lifelong gardener. I've had a really strong interest in gardening and nature. I was a free-range kid, as I refer to myself, and grew up luckily with the influence of a few wonderful teachers who encouraged that. So I spend as much of my time in the outdoors as I possibly can. In fact, I was out picking blueberries today for about 6 hours. And which is pollinated by bees, which is important. And we'll get to that. But I wanted to, what I spoke with John about doing tonight was to talk basically about bees. And just most of my knowledge is about honeybees, but I know a little bit about native bees. And so we can talk about that. And I'm a fan of all pollinators. I'm not a this team or that team kind of person. I like pretty much all insects. So, but I think just to give you an idea of scale, just about bees, there are approximately 20,000 species of bees in the world. There are about 4,000 or so that are in North America, and New York boasts about 415 or so species of bees. Interestingly enough, the honeybee, which is called Apis mellifera, is not native to North America, but it came over with the first settlers in the early 1600s, and it went feral. They went feral by swarming. We'll talk about that in a little bit, almost immediately. And so people ask, well, why did the settlers bring bees? Well, they didn't know what to expect, first of all. And also bees were an important thing for pollination, which they were bringing seeds with them to plant. But then also wax for sealing and waterproofing and honey. And so it's been very interestingly documented that the spread of the European settlers westward can be tracked with bees, the discovery of bees documented, because when they moved to a new area or discovering a new area, they would look for a bee tree and they try to find those wild bees because it was such an important element for their life, for wax and for honey. And bees would typically live in trees, hollowed out trees, or places like that. And so bees, most bees are solitary, meaning that they live over a single year. They're born typically in the spring. They mate, they lay eggs if they're female, and then they die, leaving the next generation to overwinter for the next year. The males typically, and this is solitary bees, typically emerge first, and they wait for females to come out, they mate, and then they die. Those are the solitary bees. There are also these sort of semi-social bees, which bumblebees would be a type of bee that is like that. And their colony, they live in a nest. Often you can find them. I found one or two this year already in an old mouse nest on the side of a garden. So they'll take habitat left over from something else, and they will be a colony of maybe 50 to 150 or so. And then there's the hive composition there. The colony composition is a queen, and then workers, and then male bees. And they run that same sort of sequence of, born, they raise workers, they mate, the queen mates to raise those workers. She will lay some queens that will survive over the winter in the dormant stage for the next year and then emerge. The honeybee colony is kind of different. And so honeybee colony can be massive. It can be up to 60,000 bees this time of year. And they're considered one of the superorganisms. So other superorganisms would be ants and termites. And they're an organization where it's basically a society of individuals that functions as a whole. So an individual honeybee is not going to survive for very long on its own, and it needs its sisters to survive. And sisters is important because they're almost all female in the hive, and the males don't do anything. But that's for some humor for coming down the road a little bit. So in the honeybee hive, most people know that there's a queen, and there's one queen typically, hopefully, and she's not really in charge. The bees have this kind of social structure, and they kind of tell the queen what to do. After she emerges and mates, she will come back, and her life is about laying eggs. And she will lay, this time of year, she'll lay 1,500 to 2,000 eggs a day. So a colony size for honeybees can swell from 10 to 15, 20,000 in the early spring in the Northeast here where we are. And it can go up to, like I said, about 60,000 or so to do all the work that they need to do. And they gather honey and nectar or gather nectar into honey and pollen. The queen is female, of course. All the workers in the hive are female, and they do all the work. They are the nurse bees, the cleaning bees, the guard bees, the undertaker bees, the field bees, at different roles in their life. And if anybody has seen the Bee Movie, has very little biological reality to it. I always amuse, and most beekeepers bristle a little bit about that movie. It's a very good movie, but it's not factually accurate. But the drones are the male bees, and they're basically, their whole existence is to mate with a virgin queen, not their own, but they leave the hive during the day, and they'll fly out to an area called a drone congregation area, and where they'll hang around and wait for a virgin queen to come along, and then they will hopefully mate and then die. And so that's their job. Sounds like a pretty cushy thing, except for in the fall, the drones all get booted out because they don't do any work in the hive. They don't sting. They don't gather any nectar. They don't do anything except for eat and hang around and wait for a possible queen to mate with. So I'll leave the comparisons to us for everybody to make on their own. A queen can live, roughly when I started keeping bees in 1988 or so, 89, a queen would live 2 to 3 years, and sometimes they still do. Although many queens, are, the commercial beekeepers in particular, change their queens every year for genetic reasons and then also productivity reasons, because they want to have an active, fertile queen that is laying a lot of eggs. And so having a queen and that is a fresh queen will eliminate the need for swarming. And I'll talk about swarming in a minute. So a queen can live a couple of years, 2, 3 years. Workers will live maybe 6 to 8 weeks, but they also winter over. Bees do not hibernate, but they basically form a cluster inside the hive, and they vibrate. They use their wing muscles to vibrate and keep warm, and they'll keep inside the hive roughly around 95 degrees all year round, which is kind of interesting. So when you have a hot day here, I'll see my bees outside the hive fanning with their wings to keep the air moving and keep the hive cool. But in the winter, they cluster together and they move their way slowly through their stores over the winter. So beekeepers, part of the task that we have, the management task that we have, is to make sure that we leave them enough supplies, honey and pollen, to get through the winter. And so not every year do I harvest honey. It depends on the strength of the hive. I'd rather keep the hive and hope that the hive survives rather than take the honey. So that's always a sort of management question for the beekeeper. Workers will live 6 to 8 weeks. Drones live about 8 weeks or so. The time for once a queen lays an egg, it'll take about 21 days for it to hatch and emerge into a worker bee, and about 24 days for a drone. And it's really great to see the young bees hatch, because they literally tear themselves out of the cell, and they just go right to work. They clean themselves off, and they eat a little bit, and then they just go right to work. And they learned through their sisters and through their instincts about what to do in the hive. And it's one of the more fascinating things about honeybee colonies is this hive mind and how things are decided and when things are decided, because it's really, there's so much that we don't understand about that, about when a hive decides to raise a new queen and swarm, or when they decide to go out and collect nectar, or when they decide to go out and collect pollen, when they, all these decisions, there isn't one insect in charge that makes these decisions. It is this hive mind collective thinking and this very complex communication and social interaction that they have. So how do they communicate? They communicate through pheromones, and bees' antennas they can use for smell and for taste and to touch. And a lot of times you'll see bees touching each other, interacting with each other on their hive, on the cells as they move around in the hive, because of course in the hive it's pretty much all dark, and so they have to communicate through this through these pheromones. And the queen has her own pheromone too, and so that tells the hive that the queen is alive and well and producing. And if the queen for some reason starts to fail, that pheromone will reduce, and then the worker bees will decide, well, let's raise a new queen. And so they'll raise a new queen, and that's a process called supersedure, where they will raise a new queen, and the other one will, and they'll swarm, or the other one they'll just replace her. So they see, of course, they have really good eyesight. They actually have 5 eyes, 2 of the big eyes that you typically see, but then also 3 smaller eyes on the top of their head called ocelli that are used for detecting of light. And bees do see color. they see UV, but red is not really a color that they see so well, which is kind of interesting. And so what happens in the morning, and if you ever have the opportunity to watch a beehive, it's really kind of cool to see what goes on, because the bees, they come out in the morning and they do a couple of things. They have a specialized leg in the front that cleans off their antenna, and then they'll orient themselves to the sun. And so they'll orient themselves to the sun and fly off and go on their foraging mission. And they can tell, they see UV and also polarized light. So on a cloudy day, they can navigate really quickly, and they will come back to their own hive. If you move the hive during the day, the bee will come back to where it flew from. If you move it just a couple inches, they'll find their way there. But if you move it a couple of feet, they probably won't, because they are that precise as the sun and the changes throughout the day. The hundreds of flights that they make, they orient themselves throughout the day. So it's kind of interesting. And that's an important factor in bees used in agriculture, and I'll come back to that later. But that ability to orient themselves on a daily basis is really, really, really important. They collect pollen, and they store those on little sort of saddlebags on their rear legs, colloquially called pollen pants. I forget the exact name for it, but they store the pollen in the hive, and they use it to feed the young bees, as well as the nectar. They'll mix it together, and the nectar that they gather, they will deposit in comb, and through a process of dehydration, when it reaches a certain level of dehydration, it'll become honey, and they'll cap the hive. They'll cap the comb, excuse me, and then that is considered honey. Before then, it's considered uncured, or it's got too much water in it, and it'll actually ferment if you take it out. But you can eat it at that point. It's just not as sweet. So beekeepers typically remove that capping to take the honey out at the end. Depending on the beekeeper, I harvest once a year here. Other beekeepers harvest, multiple times of the year, but I just, with the amount of hives that I have, I just do it once a year to make it easy on myself. They fly, honeybees will fly as far as they have to find forage, but they'll fly up to 5 miles or so. And they do this really interesting thing called a waggle dance, which you may have heard of, which is a bee will fly out and find some forage, a patch of clover in my lawn, and they'll go back to the hive, and then they'll present that information about that forage to the rest of the bees, and it's called a waggle dance. And this is the person is Carl von Frist was the scientist that discovered this and proved it, and he won a Nobel Prize for it. And it's repeatable. And you can do this at home if you are really into it. But the bees will do this dance where they'll come back and they will turn clockwise or counterclockwise, and then they'll wiggle back and forth. And the number of times that they waggle is the distance that the food is from the hive, and the direction that they go is the orientation to the sun. So they could communicate that to all the other bees. And it's really fascinating. It's very common to see. It just looks like a bee doing a little shimmy dance on the comb, but it's pretty cool. It's an amazing system of communication. Bees sting, but the worker bee stings, and the queen can sting, but she rarely does. The only time she does sting typically is with a rival queen. But the stinger on a honeybee, unlike a yellow jacket, the honeybee will die when it stings you, whereas a yellow jacket or a wasp can sting repeatedly. So honeybees are really docile, and for the most part, and they do not want to sting you because they don't want to die. So you really have to be threatening them in some way to get stung, or they have to feel threatened in some way. Interestingly enough, they do kind of a cool thing when they sting you, the little barbed stinger sticks in you, and then they will fly or walk away from it, and it'll basically disembowel them, which leaves a pheromone trace at the site for other bees to find you. So it's like they're dropping a flare saying, hey, this is where the problem is. And so, that's other bees will come and address that. So if you get stung by a honeybee, it's not uncommon to have a couple of other honeybees, try and sting you because they detect that pheromone. Interestingly enough, that pheromone smells like bananas. And so when you smell bananas and I smelled a lot of bananas when I was doing this film, that is an indication that this pheromone is in the air. And I proved this in my backyard I bought a little bit of banana oil and I put it on my arm, and I filmed a bee stinging me within a minute of putting a little drop of banana oil, banana extract on my arm. So it's I know it does work. A swarm, I talked about a swarm before, and a swarm is not a dangerous thing. It's when the hive splits to find a new home. And they'll do that when it gets, typically in the spring in this part of the world, when the hive gets too crowded, a little too hot maybe. And then sometimes bees have a swarmy nature. I had one hive that swarmed 3 times this year. I don't know why. They swarmed, and then they swarmed, and then they swarmed. And it's just something, every hive has its own characteristics, and so sometimes you can't figure that out. But what'll happen is when they decide to swarm, the workers will raise new queens. And so the queen pheromone that I spoke about earlier, if the hive gets too big, some of that queen pheromone may not be getting to all of the bees. And so some of the bees that are not sensing that will say, hey, where's the queen? We don't have enough queen to go around, so to speak. So they'll raise new queens. And then the half of your beehive, roughly half, will leave with the old queen and look for a new home. And then the new queens will emerge, and then they will determine who's going to be the queen. The first one out typically stings the other queens that have not emerged. She comes out first and kills them. So it's a little bit of a ruthless nature thing, but that's the way it goes. And so when the swarm happens, the queens will often, they'll fly up into a tree or land on a mailbox. And you've probably seen pictures in New York City. They had one on a hot dog stand last year. And so basically when they're doing that, they're looking for a place to live. And so it's kind of a temporary home. And so they'll hang out there, and then they'll send scout bees out to look for good options. And they'll say, oh, great. Well, Roscoe has a barn. It's got a hole in the side of it. Oh, that'd be a good place to live. Or, John has an oak tree that has a knot hole in it that's hollow. And so they'll say, okay, that's a good option. And those scout bees will come back and they'll make that presentation to the whole group, and then they'll decide what's a good place to live. As a beekeeper, it's kind of a bummer when your hive swarms, because you lose a lot of your workforce. But if somebody tells you about a swarm and you're able to capture one, and I've caught a few of them over the years, it's like finding $100 bill on the ground. It's really kind of a great thing. So if you do ever find a swarm, you can usually find a beekeeper around. I know there are a bunch of people around here that will collect swarms and take them off your hand rather than spraying them. Importantly, a swarm, if you ever see a swarm of bees, it's a fascinating thing because they're very docile at that point. You're unlikely to get stung because their concern mostly is to go look for a new home. And so last swarm I caught was actually in my yard on a low branch. I heard it, and I went out and I saw it, and I just clipped the branch and took it and just shook it into an empty hive. And they just moved right in. They were happy to be there. So sometimes that works out really well for the beekeeper. Let me see. Wax, honeycomb. So inside a typical beehive, are 9 or 10 frames. And the beehive is called the Langstroth hive, which is sort of the classic hive that most beekeepers use. And it's a standard kind of a shape. And inside there are 9 or 10 frames, and there's a beeswax template that we put in there to sort of organize it a little bit, and the bees will draw out that comb, so they'll draw it out into cells, into perfect hexagonal cells. And the bees create this wax. They have wax glands in their abdomen, and they pass the wax it sort of comes of flakes out on their abdomen, and they pass it from bee to bee, and then they use their mouth parts, their mandibles, to form into wax cells. And it's a great use of space. It's a perfect hexagonal shape, and it's one of the strongest forms, and it also has the best use of space. And they use that comb for multi-purposes. They'll use it for laying eggs and raising young, but also in other places they'll use it for storing nectar, honey, and pollen for their own use. And the bee, is just a little anecdotal fact, is oftentimes on old banks. If you pay attention to a very old bank, 19th century bank, you can see, or early 20th century bank, you can see a beehive up on the corner of the bank, because it's a symbol of saving, because bees save additional honey beyond what they actually need. And so it's this kind of a symbol that was used in the banking industry for saving. They also create this, they use this stuff called propolis, which is a resin that they collect, and they use it as a caulk to sort of seal the hive to keep draft out. And it also has some antibacterial qualities. The bees also they have a gland that they can create a substance called royal jelly. And royal jelly is a food that is fed to all larvae when they're young for a couple of days, and then they will feed it to a queen for the whole time that she's in development. And it's a super high protein substance that, the difference between feeding a bee a little bit for a couple of days or feeding it for 16 days is the difference between a worker and a queen. It's just the difference. So honeybees, so they're, it's kind of this interesting thing. Honeybees they're not pets. And we as humans have an interesting relationship with them that we've had for thousands of years. And people used Egyptians used bees. They used it for ceremonial, for honey, for pollination, they think, because there are images or there's anecdotal information about bees being moved on barges. But here in America, we've used them for pollination for over 100 years, for commercial pollination. But then they do the natural job of living, around us, either in a hive or in a tree as a feral bee. So the organization of the Langstroth hive that I talked about was from the 1850s or so. And the important thing that Langstroth, and he was a minister, determined after watching bees extensively was he figured out something called bee space. And bee space is that 3/8 of an inch space that is between the comb. And so that he figured that out and organized the removable frames that you could move in and out of a beehive that allows for reorganization, but it also allows for honey harvesting. And you say that's not a natural thing, perhaps. It's not the way bees really live in the wild, but it actually, creating wax takes a tremendous amount of resources and time. So if you can reuse the comb from one year to the next, as most beekeepers do, it saves the bees a lot of work. And so your bees can cycle up earlier in the spring a lot quicker. So pollination. Basically all bees, native bees and honeybees, pollinate. Some pollinate better than others. And why do we need pollination? Well, pollination is that process in agriculture where flowers, you move the male bits to the female bits, and that becomes the fruit, the vegetable, the nut, or the seed after the flower is over, after the flower bloom is over. And so it's interesting to think about with the evolution of bees and flowers, and the bees and flowers kind of co-evolve. They both get something from the other. The flower needs the bee to pollinate to perpetuate their species, and the bee takes from the flower the nectar and the pollen, which they need to live. And so this is interesting coevolution. And not all bees pollinate all flowers. Some bees are more generalists than others, and some are very, very, very specific. And so it depends on the flower to go along with that. Honeybees are great pollinators. They're not always the best pollinator for a particular plant. It depends on the plant or the crop. But they do have the advantage of being movable, as I talked about earlier. The fact that they go back to the hive at night, they emerge in the morning, and they orient themselves to the sun, and then they set out to forage and find out what they can eat wherever they are. And so beekeepers have taken advantage of that in a way. And so honeybees are kind of unique in the bee world, is that they are movable. So now that they're in these organized hives, you can move your hive. So I could take my hive in early April and move it down the hill to the Schoonmakers to pollinate their apples, or my bees might fly there anyway. I don't know. But they do have the ability to do that because they come out in the morning and they orient themselves wherever they are. So you can move them from here to Maine, and they would figure it out. And they also have the great ability to scale up their population so quickly with, a queen laying 1,500 to 2,000 eggs a day. Your population can go from 10, 15,000 in February to 60,000 in July. So that's kind of unique among other bees because other bees don't have colonies that same size. So the farmers have taken to moving bees commercially, not all of them, but farmers rent bees from these commercial migratory beekeepers, and it's because of the changes in our agricultural system that farmers and beekeepers are doing this. And so as agriculture has become more simplified and more chemically dependent, more monocultures of single crops, you don't necessarily have forage throughout a year that a native bee can survive on, or even a honeybee. If you're growing one crop, it flowers once a year. It might be for 2 weeks, it might be for 8 weeks. But after that, if that's the only thing that blooms there, no bee is really going to be able to survive. And so as agriculture has changed to these more monocultures and more chemically dependent, simplified agriculture, farmers have worked to basically rent bees from these commercial migratory beekeepers as almost like an insurance policy to ensure pollination happens. And that's probably most evident in almonds, which is a part of the film. And this is essentially what our film, The Pollinators, is about, is a way to talk about our agricultural system and by moving these bees. Excuse me one second. Let's get a drink. All right. I wanted to bring up the idea of bees versus wasps. And again, it's interesting to think about that kind of evolutionary development. And the bees separated from wasps millennia ago. And it's kind of an evolutionary split because bees became effectively vegetarian, whereas wasps carried on their carnivore ways. And when I say wasps, I'm talking about yellow jackets and hornets and all of the wasp family. And they get their nutrition from eating things. They'll parasitize other insects. They will eat dead insects, whereas bees are getting their protein from pollen and their carbohydrates from nectar. And so it's this kind of interesting thing where they kind of split, wasps stayed this way and bees went this way, and then it split multiple times into the 20,000 species of bees that we have in the world today that we know about. But other pollinators there are a lot of other pollinators beyond bees. Wasps are pollinators, not as effectively, and I think it's more happenstance. It's not their intent. But butterflies, of course, moths are huge pollinators that many of us don't see because they do their work at night. Birds, hummingbirds are pollinators, and other birds are pollinators. Bats, flies are actually big pollinators. Beetles, ants, and so there are a lot of different pollinators that are out there doing work in our garden. I think if you're able to sort of drill down a little bit and you start looking at what is on when I was looking at Queen Anne's lace the other day, it's not pollinated by bees, but there are a lot of little beetles on it, little insects, and I thought that was kind of interesting. So, so things that people can do to help pollinators, because everybody knows that the pollinators are, in decline. We know that there's problems with monarch butterflies. There are problems with bees. The losses among honeybees for these managed beekeepers is somewhere between 35 and 50%, sometimes more. So honeybees are not going to go extinct, but it's just going to, if they don't do better, it's going to be passed on into our food system through cost, but the cost of food. But it's also many of the things that are affecting honeybees are also affecting our native pollinators, our native bee species that don't have as much emphasis and don't have as much attention paid to them as honeybees do. They're not as well funded studies, and they don't get the PR that honeybees do, which are in many ways, I sort of think the honeybee is kind of like the panda bear of the bee world, in that they are this sort of charismatic creature that everybody likes and has an affinity for it. So some of the things that people always ask me, like, what can I do to help the pollinators? And first and foremost, I would say the most important thing any of us can do is ask questions. When you're buying some food, you're buying some produce, where does it come from? Who grew it? Were chemicals used in that? So asking those questions at the supermarket, at the nursery, at the garden shop, all the way along the line, I think is a really important thing that people can do. Another thing that most of us can do, since most of us are not in the farming industry, is to think about our lawns and reconsider our own spaces. If you maybe use pesticides or herbicides or fungicides, consider not using them. Consider adding clover to your lawn, or creating a smaller lawn and a bigger pollinator footprint if you can. And planting that pollinator habitat is hugely important. And what do bees want? All bees need a diverse successional planting of flowering plants, shrubs, or trees. And people often overlook trees, but where we live, one of the early, very beneficial pollen sources for bees is our maple trees. They have a flower that most of us don't see because it's up in the air, but it's a very important source of pollen very early on. So finding those, if you're shopping at or planting a tree, ask those questions about what pollinates those things, and then what are the pollinators that work with those, because honeybees are not the only pollinators. As I said, there are 400 plus pollinators that are around here, and so having that diverse succession of flowering plants, trees, and shrubs is super important. As I mentioned before, honeybees will fly 5 miles to find food, but many other bees, their whole life is lived in an area of maybe a couple hundred feet. And so having those small habitats for all other bees is really important. And in an urban environment, I was up in Kingston when I was doing this film, and I was standing there and looking at places, people, there's somebody through, I don't know if Vic is on here or not, but my friend Vic was putting in a pollinator habitat in somebody's yard. But also even in uptown Kingston, I was looking at the big planters that they had, and I was just amazed. I was standing there waiting for somebody, and I was amazed at the number and diversity of small insects that were there, because if you look at these smaller bees that have a very limited zone that they live in, creating this kind of mosaic of habitat, a pathway, if you will, where they can jump from one to another, fly from one place to another, is really important. So even having a very small space can be really, really, really important. The habitat that we can leave here in our yards is also important, because if you have honeybees, I mean, they live in a hive, they live in a tree, but other bees live in the ground, they live in cavities, in like a tree where a woodpecker has been in, even the stalk of last year's daylilies or other plant. Some bees will use those stalks as a habitat, a place to lay the eggs for the next generation, the next year. So leaving some of that stuff around for them and make it available is really important. Even bare soil, there's some bees that live in bare soil. So leaving a little patch of bare soil around is an important thing to do, so it's not so manicured. And then weeds, I have this thing about weeds, is that a weed to me is almost like a plant with a PR problem, right? So there's some weeds that are invasive that we don't want, and there are a long list of those, but there are other ones that are not 100% bad. And I'll bring out one that I know I'm personally conflicted with, which is Japanese knotweed. It's a terrible invasive, but it makes an amazing honey, and bees love it. And so, cause and effect, I'm also a fly fisherman, so it's not great for stream habitat, that plant as well, but it's not 100% bad. And so sometimes those weeds, they have a role. I'm not talking specifically about the invasives, but weeds in general, create habitat and resources for our bee friends. Some people are putting up bee hotels, maybe an Airbnb. I don't know. This is like, sorry, I couldn't resist that one. Which is, you see them sold, but they often have different size holes or stalks that can go in there where different types of bees can create a home. And so those are things that we can all do. You can support your local beekeepers. There are beekeepers all over this county and all over the country. Every county in every state has a beekeeping association, and I know this for a fact because I've been in touch with them all. Supporting your local CSAs and your farmers markets is really important. Those local economies is kind of the big thing that I've been beating the drum on for the last couple of years. And if it's ever been proven, by actuality, it's what we're going through right now with this pandemic, and you think about what is going on with, I know most of the CSAs have sold out all their shares for the year, which is great. And a lot of people changed their growing based on it and have ramped it up, which is wonderful. So having those local economies here and supporting those local CSAs and farmers markets are great. And then also, I had the ideas, maybe some people in the town of Rochester would be interested in putting together a community pollinator garden somewhere. It might be kind of a good project to do with the school. And so I'll just kind of throw that out there. I'm almost done with this part of it. And then I'm sure people have some questions, and I have some pictures that I can show you if you want. But the other thing I'm gonna bring into this is climate change, and why climate change and the effect of bees and insects and birds is really important. Is when you have a warm winter, you might have flowers that emerge early. If they emerge ahead of the emergence of insects that depend upon that flower, they might miss that window. And so getting out of sync with climate change is an important area of study that people are really working on now, between flowers and insects, and then also birds, because the migratory birds and even the birds that don't migrate are looking for those food sources, which often are insects or seeds. If they're out of sync, then that can throw things off as well. And so this is very interwoven relationship, particularly in climate change, that can be thrown out of order really quickly. And if you have a healthy habitat that has a lot of insects, you're going to have a lot of birds. And if you have flowers, you're going to have insects, you're going to have birds. And I know those are three things that I love in my life, in our world here, and spend too much time looking at. But those are the things that I'm really passionate about. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. I have a trailer of the film if anybody wants to see it. It's about 1.5 minutes, and I also have pictures. A thumbs up or no? Thumbs up? No? Don't want to see it? Thumbs up. Okay, great. So I'll try and do that. And I see Vic. Vic is here, Vic Klein. I'm just gonna, Vic is, she's got her martini. Sure, what did you, Cosmopolitan. So Vic is a very good friend of ours, and she's from Victoria's Gardens in Rosendale. And if you're looking for a great resource for pollinator knowledge about gardening and trees and all that, Vic is a great resource, and she's super knowledgeable and a very dear friend. So I'll show the trailer, and then I also have a bunch of pictures if you guys are interested in seeing from the film and otherwise. And then if you have questions, yeah, start firing away. But hang on, let me see if I can figure this out. Again, let me see. Oh, you know what? I forgot to click the thing. Share computer sound. Okay. I don't want that. Bear with me here. Sorry. There you go. Can everybody see that? Hopefully everybody can hear it.
Bees are so fascinating. When you first go into a beehive, you're like worried about getting stung. And then as soon as you start watching them and seeing them on the combs, communicating with each other, it's just so fascinating, so complex. And it mostly works until we get in the way of it.
Populations of honeybees are dying at levels that are unprecedented and very concerning. Close to half of the colonies in the U.S. dying every single year.
Native pollinators have disappeared, and farming has become a lot bigger, and so due to all this, now they need beekeepers that can move bees from one place to the other.
We can learn a good deal from bees about the health of the landscapes that we inhabit, and we can learn a good deal about the folly of setting up our agriculture in quite the way that we have.
Agriculture is an interruption of a natural system, but it can be done thoughtfully as an interruption of a natural system with great benefits.
It's going to take 20, 30 years for that ground to get back in the shape it was to sustain life for all these wild insects, birds, and fowl and everything else.
Protecting the land around us, protecting the soil under us is really our obligation. And from that, we get delicious, nourishing products.
We've been pollinating fruits and vegetables and nuts since the 70s, 60s, 50s, and we haven't had these kind of losses. We're not bad beekeepers, we're just trying to hang on to our business.
Hey, Peter.
Yeah. Did that work?
Video.
No?
No.
You couldn't hear it? Couldn't see it?
Could hear it, couldn't see it.
Oh, no. Okay, what do I do? Well, I guess we don't want to see that, right? Oh, sorry. I didn't see your chat over there.
I think the video was in a different window, so you were just sharing the window with the audio file. Maybe share your whole screen.
Yeah. All right. So you want to try it again, or do we want to move on?
I'd like to see it.
Okay. So, all right. So what do? I share the screen. Okay. Share the screen. All right. You see it now? Do you see?
Yes.
Yep. Got
Okay,
it.
great. Okay. All right. So I'll shut up and let it play. Sorry. Amateur, Zoom amateur.
Bees are so fascinating. When you first go into a beehive, you're like worried about getting stung. And then as soon as you start watching them and seeing them on the combs, communicating with each other, it's just so fascinating, so complex. And it mostly works until we get in the way of it.
Populations of honeybees are dying at levels that are unprecedented and very concerning. Close to half of the colonies in the U.S. dying every single year.
Native pollinators have disappeared, and farming has become a lot bigger, and so due to all this, now they need beekeepers that can move bees from one place to the other.
We can learn a good deal from bees about the health of the landscapes that we inhabit, and we can learn a good deal about the folly of setting up our agriculture in quite the way that we have.
Agriculture is an interruption of a natural system, but it can be done thoughtfully as an interruption of a natural system with great benefits.
It's going to take 20, 30 years for that ground to get back in the shape it was to sustain life for all these wild insects, birds, and fowl and everything else.
Protecting the land around us, protecting the soil under us is really our obligation. And from that, we get delicious, nourishing products.
We've been pollinating fruits and vegetables and nuts since the 70s, 60s, 50s, and we haven't had these kind of losses. We're not bad beekeepers, we're just trying to hang on to our business.
Okay, did that work?
Yeah.
Oh,
great.
good. Okay, great. Whew.
Great.
Sorry. All right, so I see I'm going to start to go through some of these questions. Do Norway maples supply nectared honeybees? I believe they do. I'm not 100% positive, but I believe all the maple trees do. So Vic is nodding yes. So, all right. Not seeing Charlie, can you start the video, hear the audio? Okay. Any other questions that you have?
We moved up here about 12 years ago, and I've always been a real avid fan of all insects, insect watcher. And I noticed how they've been diminishing every year, more and more and more.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what you were talking about, right?
Yeah, there's a worldwide decline in insect populations, and it's really tragic. It's you know, I think there was a study that I saw that 70. I'm going to get it wrong, so I'm not going to quote it. It was a German study of that there's a sort of massive insect decline. People have referred to it. There's a great article actually the New York Times did, I think in the Sunday section, called The Insect Apocalypse, that I would urge you to read. But it's
I read that.
Yeah. So it's you know, it's really it is very sad. I mean, a little bit of a insect geek myself, and not that I can identify everyone, but I just find myself looking at them all the time, whether it's you know, chasing down a cricket at night, or looking at different leaf cutters that I see whenever I'm out. You know, just there's so much, like birds in the same way. I find that amazing diversity in the insect world that is so specialized, and it's just endlessly fascinating. I think in another life I could have been an entomologist. But
I just wonder why are insects declining around here? We have in our area up here, hardly anyone uses any pesticides, and there's plenty of wild stuff for, you know, there's plenty of habitat. I would have thought.
Yeah, the people do use a lot of pesticides around here. Actually, you know, most of the agriculture, I'm going to say all of it, but a lot of the agriculture does use pesticides. A lot of the commercial agriculture. There's a lot of organic and young farmers that are using more of an integrated pest management approach. But you know, there is a fair number of pesticides. Pesticides have gotten stronger and more deadly to insects over the years. And one of the things that we go into in the film is this new class of pesticides called neonicotinoids, which are a systemic insecticide that goes into, it's coated on the seed or sometimes sprayed on the ground, but it goes up in through the vascular system of the plant. And so if a pest bites into it, that's what it's designed to do, to kill that pest. But the problem is that it gets into the nectar and the pollen. So if you have a pumpkin field that is adjacent to a cornfield, that contaminated pollen can go over onto the pumpkin field and affect those insects that are there. Plus, they're very long lasting, and they're also water soluble. So they will go into water systems too, which again, as a fly fisherman, is not something that I like to see, because fish eat insects too.
Yeah, but up here where I live, I mean, it's mostly woods.
Yeah.
And yet we still see them declining.
Yeah, I don't have all the answers for that. my mail. Um, I think some of it might be climate change, but I'm not sure. I can't answer. I know it's a big problem though.
Worldwide problem.
It's a worldwide problem, absolutely.
That article, Insect Apocalypse, one thing they talk about is the windshield test. When I was a kid, you'd go, whenever you went on a freeway, and then when you stopped, you'd be covered with splattered insects on your windshield. Now, none of that happens.
Yeah, it's very true. I know I pay attention very closely to things in our particular yard. I'm always thrilled to see fireflies that are just, we've had a lot of them this year, which to me is always a good sign. But yeah, it's very troubling for sure.
I think that lawns are basically bad.
It's I don't necessarily say lawns are bad. I mean, we have a lawn here at our house, and we have grass, but we also have white clover mixed in it, and we also have some flowering plants that are mixed into the lawn. And one of my little sort of armchair laboratory thing is to go out and look in a square yard or square meter in front of me and see how many different insects I can see, how many different pollinators I can see. I think lawns could be really, really, really improved and lessened. I know people are working on developing lawn seeding that has much more flowering, pollinator beneficial plants. And at University of Minnesota, I know, has been working on that for their parks. But if you step back and look at lawns, I think almost that's its own sort of film in a way. That's this weird sort of socioeconomic, aspirational thing of what a lawn is and what a lawn means. But I think that converting it to pollinator habitat could be something that, or converting more of it to pollinator habitat could be something that people could do that would really help.
Just have a meadow that we mow and it looks like a lawn.
Yeah.
If we let it go, it's a meadow.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Yeah. I mean, it's great. If you, in that trailer that I showed you, you might have seen a few shots around town of Rochester and Hurley and a couple other things, but there's one shot there of the church, the Rochester Reformed Church in the background is a quick shot. But that's the whole area out below the storage area on 209. And I went up there, and there's a Shane Ricks owned it at the time. I don't know if he still does or not, but I went by to do some filming up there. I said, do you realize what an amazing habitat you have right here? It was just alive with all kinds of insects and butterflies and beetles and bees, and it was just crazy interesting. And he was like, yeah, I just haven't mowed it. So I get a lot of encouragement and hope from the fact that wildlife will come back if we give them a place to live, give insects and wildlife a place to live. Okay, somebody said, I'm just gonna mute. All right, and let your edge ledges of your lawn grow up to natural improved habitat. Good idea. Any other questions about bees or otherwise?
Hi, Peter. My name's Michaela. My boyfriend and I just started beekeeping this year. It's our first year.
Woohoo.
We absolutely love it. We're super excited and find it all so fascinating. But I had a practical beekeeping question for you. We were wondering how you, here, I'll start my video. Hi, can you see me?
Hi, yep.
Hi. But we were just wondering what you do for overwintering. We've been talking to a lot of different people, and some people actually insulate their hives. Mm-hmm. So we're just wondering what your process was.
Yeah, so some people, and this is for everybody else, some people, depending on where you live, some people wrap their hives with either tar paper, or some people actually put foam insulation on them to help keep the bees warm. I don't do that, and I never have. Personally, what I think one of the biggest problems for overwintering is moisture, And so what I've done the last couple of years is I put like a Homosote board, like a half-inch board underneath the outer cover to absorb some moisture. And then I add a layer of insulation, foam insulation on that. And that's sort of, I try to do something different every year. I'm kind of a experimental beekeeper, I guess, in a way. So I try something different, see what works, and see, I try something different every year. So.
Yeah. Well, that's great insight. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and the one thing about beekeepers is that if it's kind of a joke among beekeepers that if you ask 5 beekeepers a question, you're going to get about 8 different answers, and all of them are going to be sort of right. So it's everybody has you're going to find that you'll have to get consensus and try and find out what works for you.
Yeah, figure out which works for us.
Yeah.
I actually had another question too, specifically about different types of honey. So we have, I was just reading in a book about mountain laurel honey and how it's poisonous, I guess. So we have, not on our property, but the property adjacent to us has a lot of mountain laurel. So we're just wondering like how concerned we should be about that. Like I know obviously our bees are foraging on a ton of different forage. So the possibility of us getting like specifically mountain laurel only low, but.
Yeah, I think it is low. I've heard about that, and I've never really worried about it. Although we don't have a lot of mountain laurel right where we are.
Yeah.
But I have heard about that. I would, when Hudson Valley Bee Supply. I would ask Megan and York and see what they say about that, because they might know more about that than I do.
Yeah, the research that I've done about it seems like it's kind of like the same like level of toxicity of alcohol. Like if you eat way too much of it or consume way too much of it, you could die, but within moderation, you're probably fine. So
yeah, it's just a couple of interesting kind of honey things that are related to this that I'll share with people is that bees have honeybees do this thing that is referred to as flower fidelity. So when a honeybee goes out and it'll go to the white clover in my lawn, for instance, it'll hit white clover. It won't bounce around from white clover to echinacea or whatever else. They have this flower fidelity where they pretty much hit the same flower every journey. It doesn't mean that all the bees are doing that. It means that one bee is usually practicing that. And so as Michaela sort of led into is that there are these varietals of honey. I only do wildflower honey because I harvest my honey once a year if I harvest honey. And so I get a mix of everything from the earliest maple and apple blooms right through to goldenrod and aster are the pretty much the last big ones here in our area. And so I get this mix throughout the year, which I love the wildflower honey because it's different every year, depending on the state of the bees, the where they are in the collection, and then the resources that they're able to collect that year. So some years it might be not some years, every year it's different for me, depending on the mix that the bees are collecting. And so that's kind of a cool thing. But they do have interesting varietals of honey that you might have seen. Buckwheat is one that you see, and it's very popular among Eastern European people. It's a very dark, almost like molasses-like honey. But you can also find around here, you can find clover honey or apple blossom honey, but there's also orange blossom honey, or there's just so many different varietals of honey that all have a unique taste and interesting. I had orange blossom honey this morning that somebody gave me. So it's really interesting because I love that it's not like one thing. Like white sugar is white sugar, but honey always has a unique taste. And there's a whole study of honey pairing with food, which is really interesting too. What types of honey goes best with cheese or chocolate or whatever. And so that's an interesting thing if you want to get into that.
Do you have any problems with bears?
Excuse me?
Any problem with bears?
Every year.
So I'm told that when we were looking into this, you need like electric fence or something.
Yeah, I have electric fence around my hives. We've been walloped by bears quite a few times over the years. We have them here, and this year I haven't, I'm gonna knock wood, have not been affected by them, but I know they've been out there. I've seen their footprints. And this year, because it was such a mild winter, I saw bear prints in the snow throughout the year, all year long. And bears have a terrific sense of smell, and they're also extremely clever. And so we have a 5-wire fence that goes right down to 6 inches off the ground, because one year, the first year I put bees here at this house, I had 12 inches off the ground, and I got up early one morning and I watched the bear walk around the hives and shimmied right underneath the lowest wire, and chased it out. But I was like, wow, 12 inches. It found an area that was like 13 inches. So they're extremely resourceful, clever, and I love bears, but boy, they can wipe out a beekeeper in just one night. So it's a big problem. So anybody who has bees around here has an electric fence around them, for sure.
When do in the springtime, when do the bees emerge?
That's a great question. Yeah, so bees are sort of weather dependent, right? So I have alarmingly seen bees many years. If we have a very warm New Year's Day, I'll go out and see if you have a day that's 50 degrees or more, bees will fly. And it doesn't mean they're going to find anything to eat, but a lot of times in the winter, and particularly in the early winter, if you have a warm days, the bees will what they call a cleansing flight, and so they'll go out to just sort of go to the loo, so to speak, you know. So that's what they do in the winter on a warm days, and so it's a little alarming when we have those very early days, because besides that, they want to start to look for food because they are weather, temperature, light dependent. And of course, there's nothing that early for them to feed on. And so that's part of the challenge, if you will, as a beekeeper, to anticipate if you leave them, to leave them enough food for a warm winter, they can be more active and go through their stores more quickly because they are more active, or it could be too cold that they can't move up within the hive adequately. So you have to, it's a really sort of difficult thing to try and manage them in that regard, but you sort of always have to rely, sort of fall back on leaving them a little bit too much food, because they need that honey to get going in the spring. And once that first nectar starts flowing, it motivates the queen to start laying and get things going for the year. But I always shudder when I see those warm winter days and I see bees flying, because if they can fly around, it's fine. But if they land like in the snow or something like that, they can't get their flight muscles going again.
So what kind of plants could we plant that would bloom right away for these bees?
Right away. Vic, do you want to jump in on that? Vic is can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Okay. All right. I mean, right now, echinacea for sure. I mean, that's, you know, I see them all over them at the nursery and at any garden I'm in. Any hyssops. I mean, there are yarrows. There's a ton of stuff. There's a lot of trees and shrubs that they're going to go to as well. You know, there's very little that I know that blooms at this time of year that they wouldn't go to. I know that things like forsythia do nothing for the bees. Don't plant any more forsythia. But there are plenty of plants to plant immediately that you could buy in the nurseries that would have flowers on them right now. You might even take a honeybee home with you as you move it from the shop to the home.
In early spring, like any kind of blooming flower in early spring, I guess would be good, right?
Right. So forsythia, not, because they're sterile and they're not going to do anything for anything. But there is lindera, which is a spice bush. There's a lot of things called spice bush, but lindera, which you often see blooming at the same time as forsythia, and it's sort of a woodland native plant, and it has a yellow flower on it. Hellebores, I mean, there's a lot of things that aren't necessarily native, but the bees go to like crazy, like Andromeda, which is a Japanese plant. It's not an invasive plant, but the bees are all over them when they're blooming. And that's early April, and very deer resistant shrub. That's a great bee plant and great for the home garden. Not a native though. If you know, it's not, I find that if you are too strict about the native piece, you're dismissing some plants that are good for the environment and good for the garden.
Yeah, one other thing about that is another thing about flowering plants is that some of the cultivars of doubles of certain flowers are not necessarily good for pollinators. And I'm not against them because they're beautiful and showy and all that. But again, going back to that evolution of pollinators and flowers, things that are crossed and bred to make a more showy flower may be physically impossible for a bee to get its pieces in there to do the pollination.
Such as echinacea, because the double echinaceas don't have that center crown. That is where they're normally getting their pollen. I just shared a video today of a bumblebee on an echinacea just full of pollen, but they're on that orange cone. But the double echinacea, definitely, Peter, you're totally right. The double echinacea don't have that orange cone. And so they're going to struggle, and they may even be confused and spend energy that they don't need to spend trying to figure out why doesn't this echinacea have pollen. Yeah. I mean, I don't know enough whether they do that, but that seems kind of sensible to me that they might be confused by doubled flowers.
And some of the other trees that have early flowers, like birch trees, are a great source of pollen and nectar. And they have that little comb kind of flower that is very attractive to bees. And so I think that, you know, I love gardens, but I think that trees are sometimes overlooked in terms of their sort of underappreciated flower that is beneficial for all types of bees.
And they bloom early. I mean,
Exactly.
Trees a lot of times are blooming really early before we even notice, such as maples. I mean, those red maples, you only see this mist of red in March to know that they're waking up and they're blooming. We don't see the flower. It's too far above our head. But Peter's right on that you need a diverse landscape. And I mean, that's part of what your movie talks about, Pete, is again and again, that diversity is really key to supporting the environment.
And everything.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So when you see a group of hive boxes, this is a question here.
Yeah.
When you see a group of hive boxes, how many queens are in them?
If it's a normal hive, there'll be one queen for the colony. And so a typical beehive, the Langstroth hives, and there are other types of hives that people are using, but the most popular one, the Langstroth hive, is the white boxes typically. And they're different size boxes. Most people use, or I don't want to say most people, yeah, most people use what's called the double deep, which is a deep hive body, the bottom two, and that's where the bees is basically their home. That's where they raise their young. The queen lays their eggs. They also store nectar and pollen in there. But then as the season progresses, oftentimes you'll see beehives that are different heights, and people put what's called supers on there for additional honey that the bees will collect. And so you put those supers on as the bees become more active and are gathering more nectar. And then that's where they'll store the additional honey that beekeepers will typically harvest. So, but typically there's one queen in a hive. All the workers are female, and then the drones are there strictly to mate with a potential queen in another place. Okay.
What else we have here? What's being done in this area to make farming less toxic for bees?
It's a good question. You know, some of the things that I get encouraged by in this like uber local town of Rochester are a lot of the smaller little farm operations that are tucked in. And I'm thinking of like Arrowhead Farm, which has, I think, 8 different operations on it now, from, you know, goat cheese to cut flowers. And so I think these CSAs that are popping up, and I think a lot of these younger farmers are not necessarily organic, but they're using integrated pest management techniques, which is the idea that you, instead of spraying for something before you know you have a problem, which is the way a lot of these neonicotinoid pesticides work, or putting a pesticide on a plant before you know you have a problem, they wait until they get a certain count of pests that are and then target spray what they need to for that specific pest. So I think that's a much more holistic approach if you have to spray. But some places, some farmers are growing pollinator habitat that creates areas for beneficial insects that are predators of these pests too. And so that's a really important thing. And farmers, if there's one thing I know about farmers, is they're really pragmatic, and they don't like to spend money if they don't have to. And so if they don't have to spend money on sprays or pesticide treatments, they don't, because it affects their bottom line. And the margins in farming are awfully pretty tight. So I think general awareness, to answer that question, the general awareness is increasing. I'm always happy when I see the road crews cutting the side of a road, mowing it rather than spraying it. I know some of the state roads are still sprayed around here, but I know in this town they cut the roads because those the roadside flowering plants, whether they're weeds or not, are habitat and forage for a lot of different insects. And so I think cutting is a much more beneficial way to handle that. And you know, maybe cutting a little bit less. So I think that I think that the general awareness is a big part in considering and asking those questions. I'll go back to that, because when you ask those questions, whether it's in the supermarket or a garden shop, about whether a flower has been treated with a pesticide before you bought it, 10 years ago they wouldn't have. Nobody, they would have looked at you like you landed from Mars. And now, more often than not, people can tell you that, whether, nope, this plant has never been treated, or yep, this was treated with a fungicide and blah, 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 blah. So so I think that, raising that awareness through asking those questions is a really, really important thing. So,
I mean, the other thing, Pete, that your movie, when that guy plants the crop, and I can't remember what crop it was, so that the bugs would go to the second crop. Yeah. And he was willing to let that, it was Hubbard squash, right? He was letting the Hubbard squash be eaten so he could get his pumpkins. Am I remember correctly? And that was just I loved that story, that idea that I'm planting this thing for the bugs, and then I'm going to plant, and they're going to eat this first, and then my crop's going to be left alone. I think that kind of fabulous education and knowing how to do that is growing and expanding, and really such a cool idea.
Yeah. So what Vic is, there's a scene in the film where there's a farmer in Pennsylvania who he's planting a field of pumpkins, and in advance of the pumpkins, he planted a row of blue Hubbard squash because he heard that the cucumber beetle was more attractive to the pollen on the blue Hubbard squash. And so he had this row of blue Hubbard squash that was getting affected by this pest. And so all the pests were on that row. And so he was, instead of spraying the whole field and killing all the insects, he was just going to spray that one row and take care of the problem. And it's a very powerful scene, because it's this great kind of clever innovation that this farmer did, and so it's kind of cool. I love that kind of story. So.
Yeah.
We're going to try to wrap it up here around 8 o'clock. So there's one quick question here: are there any good examples around here of meadow lawns in the area that we might get ideas from?
Interesting.
I mean, I
But,
have a job that Pete went and the footage didn't make it into the movies, but it's a job on Pearl Street in Kingston, and they put in a clover lawn, and it is madly successful. It is fabulous, and it is just full of bees. My mom tried to do that, I can remember, in the 80s, and we searched so hard for clover seed. It wasn't easy to find, but now you would be able to find it pretty easily. Vermont wildflower seed is a great resource for that. But, you know, very easy to turn your lawn into a clover lawn. That's really quite easy. And I think that the idea of diverse lawns, and also just if they're not being chemically treated, then they're a fine thing. It's the thing about having lawns that are chemically treated, and, you know, that people are over fertilizing them and wanting them to be golf green like, is just, that's where it becomes unhealthy for the environment.
Yeah, I you know, one of my armchair activities is when I drive around is looking at what is in people's lawns. And you can, you know, like last week I was driving up Towpath Road here, and I saw a couple of yards that just had like a white sheen across it that was all white clover. And that's like a great example of people just integrating some sort of flower. Or ajuga is another one. I don't know what the proper name for that is. Yeah, it's a little blue flower that we had that was growing in our lawn, and it's just, bees just love that. It's just fantastic. So
I want to point out that the ECC is working with the Town of Rochester Town Board to create a pollinator garden underneath the solar panels that they've installed over behind Rainbow Diner. So that's going to probably happen at some point in the future.
They want to do the same thing behind the gym in Stone Ridge.
Yeah.
It's funny.
You know, there's a consciousness here.
Yeah, there's I have a friend who does pollinator habitat specifically for solar farms out of Minnesota. And when Nexamp came in with the solar projects, there was the one question I've been on them about that, because they promised me that the other one behind the landfill is going to be, they're going to incorporate pollinator plantings into that. I have an interesting story, a quick story, and I know we want to finish this up, about, I met a guy in Vermont who is he's a trauma doctor, ER doctor in Vermont, but he also is a beekeeper, and he has a passion for pollinator habitat. And so because Vermont economics were with dairy, you know, people were like, dairy is in such trouble. So a lot of dairy farms were incorporating solar farms into, you know, a few acres here, a few acres there. But the problem is that they lost their ag deduction for that area of land once they converted it to solar farms. So what he has going is he has the idea of incorporating pollinator habitat to that, but also harvesting the seeds from that. And so when you harvest the seeds, you get the ag deduction back. And so it's like a great adaptation to that thing. Plus, he's creating these new pollinator-specific flowering plants that are useful for other people doing the same thing. So it's a great innovative way of thinking.
So I just want to mention also next month, the next third Thursday, we're going to highlight fruit trees and nut trees that you can plant in your yard. Hortus arboretum from Stone Ridge, Scott and Allison are going to present for that. The small botanical garden, and they have a lot of great stuff there. I've been there a couple of times, and they have native and also out of area as well. And after that, we're working on getting a meteorologist here to talk about how they predict weather, because how can they do that? You know, like know 10 days from now whether it's going to rain or not. I mean, there's some degree of accuracy, yeah, but I think it's going to be very interesting. And what else here? Methods of organic farming. We're going to get the Farm Hub over here pretty soon. And that's it. If at the top of this list here, you can email ECC to be on the list of, you know, when it's coming, we'll let you know. And lastly, if you're interested in joining the ECC, we have room available. And we care passionately about the environment, and if you do also, it's not a huge time commitment, but it's a lot of fun, and you're contributing to the greater good. So, Peter, thank you very much. It was a great.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great. Thanks for having me on. I'm going to include. I'm just going to pop into the chat there just some information, my contact for people if they want it.
Yeah. How we can watch your movie too.
Yeah, it's on iTunes and Amazon and Google Play and all that stuff. On our website, there's information about where to screen it. There's information about the film, pictures from the film, the trailer is on there. But there's also a Take Action page, which is a work in progress. And what that is we're looking at it as kind of a resource for people about all things bees, from universities that offer bee programs to who to call if you ever see a swarm of bees, to information of all sort of types. So it's a great resource, and there's also a bee fact thing, an educational fact thing that we're using for schools. So, but mostly, thank you, John, for having me, and it's great to be here. I wish we could all meet in person, and we will soon.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Weird to do it this way, but it's easy to get to.
Yeah. And I think that just one other thing about the film is that we are tentatively scheduled to do an outdoor screening at Arrowwood Brewery in September. And Roscoe and I are on the board of the Rondout Esopus Land Conservancy, and that would be an event that we're doing, and hopefully things will progress for that. But it might be kind of a fun with a blow-up screen outside to see it and drink some beer too. So
please let the ECC know, and we'll send it out to our list.
I will indeed. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's pollinate everybody's.
Yes. Cross-pollinate.
Cross-pollinate.
Yeah. This was great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Roscoe. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Yeah,
Bye,
thanks, you guys.
everybody.
All right, take it easy.
Bye.